Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity, the podcast that explores what it takes to be well in a busy world. With self-care strategies from Chinese medicine, functional medicine, Ayurveda, neuroscience, and beyond. I'm your host, Brody Welch, a licensed acupuncturist and transformation catalyst, here to support you on your journey of health, happiness, and personal evolution. Welcome to A Healthy Curiosity. I'm your host, Brody Welch, and I thought I'd kick off this new season of the show with getting back to my roots as a Chinese medicine practitioner, and specifically thinking about what episode might be of real service to other practitioners out there in answering one of the most common questions that we typically get in our practice. Or maybe an episode for you, the dedicated listener, who would just love for someone in your life to access the healing potential that acupuncture specifically has to offer. But you've got a skeptic in your life who isn't going to sign up for that kind of a treatment unless they understand, how does it work? This is actually a pretty tough question to answer, in that from a scientific biomedical perspective, in sort of modern research terms, we don't actually know the complete answer to this question in its totality. However, there are plenty of mechanisms of action that have been identified. And so with me today is Mark Whalen, who is an owner and acupuncturist at 5 Points Acupuncture and Wellness. He first became interested in acupuncture when he was a patient facing an unwanted surgery for nerve entrapment. Mark turned to acupuncture, which not only resolved his issue, but it changed the course of his life. He went on to study and graduate from the New England School of Acupuncture in 2005 with a Master's of Acupuncture in Oriental Medicine. He's certified in acupuncture by the Massachusetts Board of Medicine and in herbal medicine by the NCCAOM. And he believes in integrating traditional Chinese medicine's model with modern allopathic medicine to get the best results for his patients. And I'm so excited, Mark, that you're here to join me for this conversation, because I put this out in one of the places acupuncturists hang out online, and in one of our community groups. And just in terms of how do we answer this question? And you had such a succinct and beautiful infographic that it was clear to me that you spent some time trying to translate this and make it real for people. So I'm delighted that you're willing to have this conversation with me to sort of demystify the, in broad strokes, high level overview of how our medicine works. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Brody. It's a pleasure.
So before we dive into answering this question, I'd love to just hear how you went from acupuncture naive and acupuncture agnostic to being a practitioner yourself.
Honestly, it was a course of desperation, unfortunately. As you mentioned, I had an ulnar nerve entrapment. I had moved from Boston to Texas for a job, started to notice really ice cold hands, numbness, tingling. Went to a neurologist. They diagnosed me with the entrapment. They tried some medication, didn't work. Then they're like, we got to cut you open and move your nerve around. I'm like, no, you don't. We're going to try something else.
Yeah, maybe later.
Yeah. And, my boss at the time was kind of a sarcastic guy like me. And he's like, oh, you should try acupuncture. You're into some weird stuff. And I said, okay. Next day, I found a brochure for an acupuncturist randomly. And I called him up. I went in, about a month later, the problem was gone, completely fixed up. I was blown away. Went back, had another nerve test. The doctor was like, just keep doing what you're doing. It's probably been 20 plus years now. I don't even know what hand the problem was in. I can't even remember. It's been that long and it worked that well for me. So at the time, I wasn't taking very good care of myself. So I kept going and just talking to the acupuncturist more and more about what he does for people. And I got more and more interested. So the funny piece to me is he was an acupuncturist from Korea that I met in Texas, who told me about a school in Watertown that I lived a mile away from before I moved, and I never knew it existed. So it was just kind of the circuitous route to end up back home.
Oh, I love that so much. I love a lot of it because, first of all, you had complete healing in a way faster time than if you had done nothing, right? And where what is it, neurosurgeon or neurologist told you basically surgery is your choice. There really is no other like options out there, right? I mean, like there's like what else out there can help restore nerve function to the point where you don't even remember what hand it was on.
Right. I mean, that's what amazed me. It was, it was anti-inflammatories for a month, try to rest it, very little even option of a PT didn't help. And then it was just, okay, let's cut you open. It was like, that seemed very quick and aggressive. And, I was fortunate that I found this guy in Texas to help me out.
How many treatments did you have?
Oh, probably 8 or 9. It was probably like twice a week for a month. Honestly, it wasn't a
Yeah.
lot.
Yeah.
And it was just, I remember the first time he started needling one of my arms. I'm like, no, it's the other arm. He's like, yeah, I know. He's like, just relax.
Right.
Like,
I got you.
Now it makes sense. Back then I was like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing.
Right.
But he clearly did.
Can you explain, like now, based on what you know now, why is needling the other arm not stupid?
Well, it's, what we would call an imaging system. So the whole body's interconnected from the time we're, one cell organisms and we're growing from that. All these neural connections stay intact. So there's all these not only neurological, but muscle channel connections. So you can use different body parts to treat what we would call distally away from a pain area. So you don't have to needle into an inflamed tissue per se. You could needle, use the opposite elbow, or use a knee to treat an elbow, or a shoulder to treat a hip, things like that. All these connections are still kind of communicating inside the body.
And this is from back when we were embryos, right?
Yeah,
This is like
exactly.
these are originally how, from the level of cells being created and dividing, that there are still these connections that are that abide within the body, and it's not necessarily a system that is utilized. I don't believe in any other form of medicine except possibly myofascial release, right? Like this, fascia being this three-dimensional web of connective tissue, and acupuncture acts on the fascia in a way, and is able to create a signal that gets the body's attention so that the body can go in and repair an injured area. And I love that sort of, already we're getting into this notion that there's more than one way to treat something. You can go in locally and talk to the local area. The needle I like to think of as like a portal of consciousness, really, like getting the body's attention and saying, hey, you've got more to do here. And that's something that can be done locally, but it's also something that we don't ever have to touch the injured area in order to treat it.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. I mean, people still ask me, how did they figure this out thousands of years ago? I'm like, I have no idea. I don't
Yeah.
care. I just know
Yeah.
that they did, and
Exactly.
it works. I do a lot of local treatment with like electrical stim, and the distal still seems to be, from a practitioner point, kind of the fun. We get like that kind of wow from a patient. They're like,
Mm-hmm.
how did that just work? And you're like, it did. Ta-da.
Right.
For my next trick.
Yes.
No, it's
it does seem like magic, right? Because magic is just science we don't understand yet. And so, but I think that imaging and mirroring idea, if we think about, just to kind of give people a sense of what we're thinking about, reflexology, right? The idea that points in the foot correspond with the whole body. Well, in acupuncture, the hand represents the whole body. The scalp represents the whole body. The foot represents the whole body. The abdomen represents the whole body. The whole arm represents the whole leg. The whole, there's so many, we can basically turn any part of the body. The ear, a common microsystem that we use to affect the whole, is this notion essentially that we're like these fractals. They're representations of the whole exists in pretty much any part, and if we look at that, we have the ability to affect change in the whole. Let's get into some of the science of how acupuncture works. And so, like, what's your simplest top line answer when a patient asks you how this medicine works?
The first thing I'll tell them is that we're basically resetting the nervous system. We're working with their own internal mechanisms to heal the body. We're basically using the chemicals that already exist within them to correct whatever their problem happens to be. And that all happens through the communication from the brain and the spinal cord, kind of on down, back to the pain areas. Through the needling, we're triggering a cascade of reactions that send signals up to the brain, and then endorphins, pain-killing chemicals, anti-inflammatories, immune chemicals, they're all getting released and headed out to fix the problems that are going on within the person.
So we've got endorphins, we've got other neurotransmitters. We've got basically we're getting the attention of the central nervous system to stimulate homeostasis, right? The body always wants to heal itself. And so we're essentially giving it a little nudge in the right direction.
Absolutely. We're one of the big things I think is we're just taking people out of that constant fight or flight mode, right? We're not being chased by tigers anymore while we're hunting for food. We're upset that we're waiting in line at Starbucks for too long, or someone cut us off. And we seem to be, constantly in this overdrive, and acupuncture just hits the brakes on that and really gets that parasympathetic, or the rest and digest as they call it, kicks that system in and allows the body to respond to treatment and heal better.
I think that's such an important point. People forget that we have to be relaxed in order to heal, right? That rest and repair, rest and digest, that is parasympathetic state. And we can't be in parasympathetic state if we're stressed all the time. And so if we're constantly, if the body is biased towards this, being in emergency mode all the time, which ultimately we should only go into when our lives are being threatened. But as you stated, so often the things like waiting in line, having a deadline, these things are not threatening our survival, but we perceive them as potentially threatening. And so our nervous system reacts accordingly. We kind of are in this mild or moderate or severe version of fight, flight, freeze in a chronic way. And the body's always going to prioritize survival at the expense of things like digesting our food or being able to reproduce or having a strong immune system, like all of these things
Right.
that get affected from being in kind of chronic fight or flight. So for somebody who's listening and they're like, oh, well, that's totally me, right? That I have trouble sleeping. I have inconsistent digestive issues. I have PMS. I have, like all these things that could very well be rooted in hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis disorder, because that's going to affect everything. That sort of gives us a sense of like, because we can go down to the very root of what's going wrong in this central nervous system cascade HPA axis, that means that we have the ability to affect so many different systems of the body, right? We can talk to the endocrine system, we can talk to the cardiovascular system, we can talk to the digestive system, especially when stress is a factor.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the beauties of this medicine, is that, like if that person you just mentioned was a real patient, they're looking at, going to a gynecologist, going to a doctor for stress, going to another doctor for pain, right? So they're all over the place all the time with these appointments. We can look at kind of what's going on and kind of narrow it down to what we would call a pattern diagnosis, and identify what's triggering all of this and treat them kind of all at once for everything.
In such a more elegant way, right? Like, because then we're able to get to the root of the problem, as opposed to the person taking 3 different medications for 3 different conditions prescribed by 3 different specialists.
Yeah, I think to some people who don't understand, acupuncture sounds like snake oil, because we're like, we can treat all these different things, and it just doesn't seem realistic. But the body's doing the work. We're just the stimulus to give it a push or a nudge to make the proper corrections. The ability is already there.
Yes.
It's just being blocked or not working, not functioning properly, for lack of a better word.
I love that you bring up the fact that like it's the power of this medicine is not in the needles, it's in the body. It's in the body's intelligence and innate wisdom, which we can trust. Like we forget, I think sometimes, that the body is really smart. That for all the things that we can suffer from, if you cut yourself, you're going to heal without having to think about it. Like your body is always trying to even things out and to get into that repair mode. And so if we can give it a nudge, if we can kind of create that micro trauma that gets the body's attention, so that maybe locally we're stimulating a reaction, getting the body's attention. But we can do that with an acupuncture needle. We can do it with a well-placed thumb in the form of acupressure. But the difference there is that you can't be pressing lots of points at the same time for, 20 to 30 minutes and getting the same effect. And I think that this is one of the things that gets in the way of acupuncture being able to be studied like through the lens of the randomized double-blind study being the gold standard for research. Acupuncture doesn't lend itself super well to that, because it's hard to not know that you're getting acupuncture. And so
Right.
some of the ways that this has been studied is with like sham acupuncture, quote unquote. I wanted to just bring this up briefly because it's the idea that that nothing is truly inert. If you've got some of the ways that they do sham acupuncture is like needles, but not at non-acupuncture points. Another way that they do sham acupuncture research is by having basically toothpicks that stimulate a point on the skin without actually inserting it, which of course is still talking to the body. It's still kind of creating it's still sending a signal. And so, for example, in the study about back pain that showed that acupuncture not only outperformed the standard of care, but that sham acupuncture also outperformed the standard of care. And the conclusion that was publicized in many articles written about it is like, acupuncture no better than sham for pain. It's like,
Right.
I would draw a very different conclusion from that. It's like, first of all, why is acupuncture or even fake acupuncture not just what we're doing in general? But the fact that there is a difference between the sham and the real, and the fact that we haven't necessarily figured out a way of replicating acupuncture that's still inert.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I pay very little attention to the double-blind acupuncture studies that they try because, like you said, it's really hard, and you can't double-blind an acupuncturist. We know what we're doing,
right.
At least we should, right? So it's hard to make that work for that particular lens. But I pay a lot more attention to like the mechanism of action studies, like what chemicals get released when a needle goes in, what's happening in the body, because I think
Let's
those
talk
are
about
much
that.
more relevant.
Yeah, let's definitely talk about that. I know there are probably some biology nerds out there who'd be really curious.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not the most qualified to talk about this. Like, you had Mel on in the past. She's definitely she knows her stuff with all of this. But like adenosine is one that she talks about a lot.
Yep.
Being a major chemical that's released with acupuncture, and it happens to have potentially major effects in almost every system in the body, right? So just by releasing that, we're having this cascade of effects everywhere.
Yeah, and adenosine has to do with our perception of pain.
Yep.
So that's one of its functions. And there's let's see, and in terms of neurology, is it agrin? It's another chemical that's released that basically helps to preserve nerve function in crush injuries. Like, that basically tells the nerve, like, hang on, help is coming, you're going to be okay. While if the acetylcholine, it can't get to the nerve to allow that muscle to function, that it's basically it functions like a preservative.
It's amazing.
And yes, to refer back to, I did an interview that we will have a link to in the show notes with Dr. Mel, and she definitely gets into some of the research. And so let's get back to like maybe filling this out with an example of, like, let's say somebody is experiencing pain, and it's like they don't know whether it's musculoskeletal, they don't know whether it's arthritis, or they don't quite know what tissue is involved. They just know that they've got, like, let's say hip pain that's been going on for a while. Do we as acupuncturists need to screen for what kind of tissue it is? Like, does it matter to us what's going on?
Typically not. I mean, we do an assessment to try to figure out, if it's muscular, what muscles are involved, if it's, if there's a pinched nerve or things along those lines causing tingling and numbness. I think it becomes an issue if they don't get better, then there's potentially something structural going on that maybe they should be looked at. But most of the time, if they respond to treatment, it's not a structural issue, right? Even if it's arthritis per se, that doesn't mean they're not going to get better. I think most of us over 30 have arthritis by now.
Yes.
That would show up on a scan, but it doesn't matter because we're not in pain.
This episode is brought to you by the coaching division at brodywelch.com. Could a 5 to 10 minute daily practice and 5 phone conversations really change your life? They did for my client Amanda, a high-powered doctor, mother, and activist who is struggling with chronic stress and low self-worth. She sorely needed time to meditate, exercise, make art, and just enjoy herself, but she felt guilty for saying no. She invested in my Getting Unstuck package and experienced a massive upgrade. She writes, "It's still mind-blowing to me how starting with little actions, for me the 5 to 10 minute breathing exercises and meditation, made such palpable differences. That made things like eating better, taking breathing breaks throughout the day, and exercising easier. Inexplicably though, that resulted in less comparison, less caring of what other people think of me, and more self-worth. That I was not expecting. In retrospect now, it makes perfect sense how you connected everything. I know that if I get sucked back into the urgency of the world and its expectations of me, that I will find my way back. I still love calling out, oh, there's that wood element again, when I rush to complete something despite being exhausted." See, there's a connection between how we take care of ourselves and how we feel about ourselves. I have a framework that can help. Yes, you do still have to do the work, but it might well be faster, easier, and more potent than you can ever imagine. Visit brodywelch.com/coaching, or just write to me at brody@brodywelch.com. That's Brody with an IE and Welch with a CH, and start getting unstuck today. Yeah, and I think that's really another important thing to help people remember is that we have such a material bias in the West. Like if we think about ourselves as sacks of meat and we get like an X-ray or an MRI, we get some sort of imaging that tells us, oh, well, you've got like a disc that's prolapsed or herniated and it's touching this nerve. So therefore, like you're going to be in pain until we fix it. And people can't wrap their heads around, well, how can acupuncture move the disc back so that I'm not in pain anymore? And I like to respond to people that like, that's actually not what we're doing. But there's plenty of people who walk around with that same X-ray or that same it's sort of scenario going on internally, and they're not in pain. So what's the difference? And it's like, I don't have a good answer for that, except for the fact that if if we take the view that we're not just sacks of meat, that we're actually giant fields of energy that are changing all the time, which is exactly what physics tells us, right? Like that we're mostly empty space with tiny little bits of matter. And so if we think about like, that talking to the bioelectricity of who we are rather than the stuff of who we are, we can make change at this level. And I appreciate your point about the fact that like, yeah, for the most part, we don't care. For the most part, we just need to know where it is and what it feels like. And we can apply our theory looking through the sort of the blend of like, I know you probably do this as well. We've got two maps in our heads, right? Of acupuncture channels and meridians, as well as origins and insertions of muscles and nerve pathways and all that we think about, and that we're able to, and basically it's like, I take a, until I'm proven wrong, I'll give it a shot with someone. And if after a handful of visits, things really aren't changing or aren't staying better for more than a few days, then I might assume that there's something structural in the way where surgery might actually be the best option for someone, as opposed to coming in for far more acupuncture than might be time or money wise efficient. But pretty much it's like, it doesn't take very long to figure out. And typically, like if we think about, just for those who might be listening who are less familiar with the process, that acupuncture works by re-educating the body. And so it is a process. And just like we wouldn't go into an operation to fix something and a third of the way through end the process and expect there to be a result, one has to get acupuncture for a required dosage in order for the effects to really take. And I think that that's a process that we as acupuncturists are doing our patients a disservice, I think, by letting somebody make an appointment for one visit. It's like they might leave feeling a million times better, but it's very likely that it's going to take a handful of visits, kind of like physical therapy or chiropractic, right? That it's a re-education process.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the things we see. We're kind of the medicine of last resort for people. They've done everything else. Sometimes they've even had surgery already. By the time they found us, they've had a problem for 10 years and they come in, skeptical to not believing at all that it's going to help them. And they expect us to fix them in like one visit. You're like, well, if you expected that, why'd you wait 10 years to come in? Right. There is that re-education process of, you didn't get sick overnight.
Yes.
You don't wake up with diabetes tomorrow. You've been doing this for a long time. The body's been breaking down and it's going to take time to fix it.
Yeah.
So there is that educational piece. I always just compare like, for me, I give a simple one of diet and exercise. You don't lift once and then have a beach body tomorrow.
Exactly.
Right? It's a process.
It is. It's a process, and that's actually, in terms of like the other branches of the medicine that we can prescribe for people, things like qigong or ways of moving and breathing differently. That we also have that in our toolbox to be able to equip patients to take care of themselves in between visits, and that's, I think, also a really important part of healing, way more than what an acupuncturist, like, for I think for a lot of these lifestyle, these sort of internal medicine diseases, stress related stuff, it absolutely, like, what we can do for our people is give them a break from that, but it's ultimately on them to construct a life that allows their hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis to not constantly be dysregulated.
Right. Yeah, we got to give them the tools to help themselves so they
Yeah,
don't need us. I mean, I tell every
exactly.
patient, my job's to get rid of you.
Yes.
Nice to
And
meet you. Get out.
exactly, right.
You know.
Refer your friends. Thank you.
Yeah.
And yeah, definitely. And but at the same time, like, for what we're talking about, like this sort of nerve, a musculoskeletal injury where somebody really does need acupuncture. They do need that needle magic that is only magic because we haven't necessarily proven all the mechanisms of action. So what's going on when we put an acupuncture needle in the body? Like, can you walk us through what that's doing?
Yeah. So, a lot of acupuncture points they've shown are located in higher areas of kind of superficial nerves and blood vessels and, neuromuscular attachments. So, we put the needle in and it's stimulating, all of these structures. It's stimulating the connective tissue as well. And it starts to release all these chemicals, like right at the needle insertion, you get white blood cells, red blood cells, calcitonin G related peptide. I don't want to bore people with all these, but you start to
Yeah.
stimulate all these kind of immune factors and other things that start to kick off, improve circulation in the body. And it starts to get signals traveling from the needle site into the spinal cord up to the brain. And once you hit the central nervous system, that's kind of where the magic starts to happen. One very commonly known point is like large intestine 4, right? On the webbing of the hand between the thumb and the index finger. That
Commonly known
point,
as the headache point, for
yeah,
good reason. It
exactly.
does so many more things than that, but it's like worked its way into popular sort of knowledge because it's so effective. So tell us about large intestine 4. What's it doing?
So that point it has a like kind of a direct link into the hypothalamus. So when you're needling that point, you're not just needling the hand, you're getting a signal right into the hypothalamus, which will start to downregulate pain signaling. And again, it connects to that HPA axis. Even the hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis can be affected through that. So it has these wide ranging systemic effects just by needling that one point, which is pretty cool.
It is really cool. And this is maybe where this warrants a little sort of side pathway over to the fact that different points have different functions. Like, if we think about the channels of acupuncture, that, we think about these lines on the body that energy or chi is said to go down. And like, we can think of it as like really one system, but we just happen to call some of it the lung channel, and some of it the large intestine channel, and some of the stomach channel, and some of the spleen channel. And these are pathways that are named for the internal organs that they connect with, but they're places where, so like, the points are on the surface, but they connect deeply to these internal organs and kind of these other areas of the body. And so different points along the pathway, like, that basically, if we getting the channel is the first step, and then getting the point along the channel that has a very specific job and a very specific function that have all been identified classically, that if there's 45 points on the stomach channel, they all don't treat the stomach the same way, right? Some of them don't treat the stomach at all. They just treat, like, for, the either locally, or points like on the face, that correspond with it. So getting a point that is going to have a particular function, and then pairing it up with points that have slightly different functions. It's kind of like, I liken it to kind of pressing keys on a keyboard to create a chord in the body. So it's like, okay, we are moving the energy, we're moving it up to the head, and we are, like that, basically we're creating a message that becomes coherent with the combination that we choose. And so, just like different friends of ours might bring out different aspects of our personality, how we pair the points brings out different effects that they have going on. So, for example, stomach 36, a point on the lower leg that regulates stomach acid, it's like it's going to have a homeostatic effect. It's going to either increase stomach acid if you have too little, or decrease it if you have too much. But we can, as practitioners, can fine tune it. If we suspect that there's a deficiency, we can couple that with other points that are, what we would consider tonifying or nourishing for that system, and we'll combine it with different points if we believe that there is an excess or like too much heat. Like, what's wrong with this ecosystem? What does it take to balance it out?
Yeah, it's like a giant puzzle that we're trying to figure out and put all the pieces together, which as a practitioner is the fun part, right? Is trying to identify the root cause and figure out what the best combination of points or herbs and things like, breathing exercises, what's the best thing for this individual in front of me right now, right? Not what's the
Exactly.
best thing for, low stomach acid. It's all individually based on someone's presentation and what's causing their problem. That's another big differentiating point between us and kind of the other systems of medicine that are, okay, this is what you got, this is the medication you get, and see you later. The body doesn't work that way.
Exactly, right. Because that really, what is the person experiencing? If they've got stomach issues, well, is it stress related stomach issues? Is their diet full of cold food that's hard to warm up? Is it full of spicy food? Likely, all of those three things are going to require a different plan of care that, as an acupuncturist, we would need to figure out for someone based on what their tongue looks like, what their pulse says, what the answers to the questions that we ask them, as well as maybe points that we palpate.
Yep, absolutely. And that's where the putting the pieces together comes in with the diagnosis that we do. And, internal medicine requires a different kind of, I think, I don't know if skill set's the right word, but it takes a little bit more prying to figure out the internal conditions versus, my shoulder hurts.
Yeah.
It's a different level of complexity when you start dealing with things like headaches or fertility or digestive problems.
Yeah, exactly. Or mental emotional issues for that matter,
Yeah.
which is, I think, super cool. Like, we know that acupuncture can help with depression and anxiety, right? We've been talking about just the chill out effect of the central nervous system. It is not uncommon for people, even people who are apprehensive about the needling process, which, just incidentally, they shouldn't be, because we can fit 20 to 30 tiny acupuncture needles inside a standard hypodermic, right? It's just a different tool that we're using. But most people go to sleep on the table, or, we find them drooling, or we find them just in like a super relaxed state that I like to think of as aculand.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally relaxing once they get past that fear of needles. Like,
Yeah.
people have this idea that we're just going to come at them with these giant hypodermics and just stab, poke, poke, and it's not the case. It's very gentle and relaxing.
And that said, it's not. People should expect to feel their bioelectricity. They should feel like what an acupuncturist might refer to as getting the chi, or the arrival of the chi at the point, de chi, which can feel like a light bulb going on, or something that, when that quote unquote chi arrives at the point, it feels like a slightly electrical sensation. And that's exactly what it is. We're talking to the body's intelligence, the body's bioelectricity, which happens in this quite electrical way. Getting into the state of relaxation that we were just touching on, that it's been recently discovered that acupuncture works on the endocannabinoid system. So part of its function has to do with our body's endogenous chemicals that are similar to what we might experience with using cannabis, which is fascinating.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. I'll be honest, I don't know a lot about that particular branch of the research yet. I've heard it,
Yeah.
but I haven't dove into it. But it's certainly interesting.
Yeah, well, there's so many. I mean, there's so much. Like, this conversation could go on forever, and like this, and it's not meant to be the be all end all discussion, but simply to give people a sense that there is absolutely good science behind many mechanisms of action of acupuncture, and really, it's that the medicine speaks for itself, and especially, when I think about the fact that it works on pets despite their bias one way or the other.
Right. I mean, there's the notion that it's like just placebo, this just indicates that for thousands of years, all of us practitioners are charlatans and every patient's, a clown that can't figure it out. It's kind of a ridiculous notion just on its surface, right?
Really good point. Really good point. Other conditions that we might not have talked about, is there, can you give us a sense of what else can acupuncture help with?
almost, any of the major systems in the body, right? So digestive function, endocrine disorders, immune function, cardiovascular, helping improve blood flow, cholesterol, blood pressure, all the mental, emotional issues. Pain obviously is a huge one. There's very few things that come in that I'm like, you know what, I can't help you.
Yeah.
Or it's not worth even trying.
Right.
It just depends on the level of severity of the condition and what it looks like when the patient shows up.
Absolutely. Is there any other aspect of the science of how it works that you want to make sure that people get or understand from today?
The one piece that I'm particularly interested in lately in terms of mental, emotional health and anxiety is there's research showing that we can affect what's called the default mode network of the brain, which is this
Let's
kind of
talk about that.
different brain regions that are basically like responsible for daydreaming, right? It's when your mind is not focused on a task, the default mode network kind of takes over. And it's shown to be very high, obviously, in anxiety, depression, like kind of overactive. But there's also research that shows it's overactive in like back pain. So it's not just for mental health stuff. And, certain acupuncture points are shown to influence, like Sanjiao 5 on the wrist, or pericardium 6 on the other side of the wrist. Those points have been shown in some studies to have an effect on that network, which is really cool. I mean, I'd love to, I wish I had brain scanning devices here in the office and start lighting people up with to see what happens.
Oh, that would be so fun.
I think it's a really interesting area that I'm trying to dive more into in my spare time. Because I think it could have wide-ranging effects if, and it's just more evidence to show that what we're doing is not this inert thing. It's influencing the brain, which is kind of the central computer.
It is fascinating that, it's definitely, I am super intrigued by how acupuncture affects the brain as well, and know that there is that default mode network. It has huge ramifications for things like depression, but also, cognitive and behavioral disorders, and just the potential there is huge, I think. Well, I'm sure you and I could talk forever about how cool acupuncture is, and how much we would love to study people's brains. The other cool thing is, I know there have been studies where that acupuncture for injuries, where in fMRI machines, that when an injured area is needled, that it takes 22 to 25 minutes or so for the muscle fibers to magically know who they belong to and reorient from being a big jumbled balled up cluster or an adhesion to reorganizing and kind of, again, that. To me, it's such a, we know that typically 25-30 minutes or so is about the amount of time that someone is typically on the table. And I love that we're finding out that it's just through imaging that is actually the amount of time that if you're needling locally, that it takes for that signal to be received and for the body's intelligence to go, oh, I know what to do with this.
Yeah, it's amazing. I think we've all heard of the gallbladder 37, right? The bright eyes point that when you needle it, the fMRI lights up the visual cortex.
Oh, I didn't know that one. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, you haven't heard that? Oh, yeah. That's I remember hearing that one back, I don't know, maybe back in school, but that's just a really cool thing. Like the point name translates to bright eyes and the visual cortex lights up. That's crazy to me because it's, they didn't, I don't want to know if they were, there's no way they could have done that,
No, right. Right. And yet there it is. And that's actually, so if we have 365 or so classic points that actually have these poetic names that meant something to, that, and all the points still have names that most of us learn in school. But then as practitioners, we start referring to them by their channel and number, right? So bubbling spring becomes kidney 1, and something is lost there in that translation. And so there is something, I think, that that as, while I am all in favor of us as Chinese medicine practitioners being able to speak the language of science and be able to get the buy-in from those of us who've grown up in the West and who tend to see Western medicine as the medicine or as the only valid medical option. Yeah, it's important for us as acupuncturists to say hey, we're real medicine too. And that just because there's a lot that science doesn't know about this yet, that doesn't make it invalid, and that furthermore, there really is something lost to Chinese medicine to try to wedge itself into a model that is only looking at the evidence and the data without looking also at the way that sort of like the classical interpretations of what these points are for, because it might take another 100 years before we know that gallbladder 37 does XYZ of its other 10 functions, right? But it's like, that's not going to stop me from using that point today,
right.
and getting results with our patients. So I think it's really, that I think that's a trap that we can fall into of as practitioners, of completely rejecting the original context and the sort of the poetry and the metaphor that Chinese medicine communicates. And I think especially on mental health issues, that I think it really important to note that in Chinese medicine, that problems that we're referring to, like things like matters of the heart and matters of the spirit, were referred to not necessarily in language that we would describe today, but often as physical indications, right? So, for example, heart pain isn't necessarily angina, right? Heart pain can be heartbreak. It can be, so that's one of those indications where like we can get at these various, and like the idea that when someone comes in for something like depression, well, we don't just treat depression, we unpack that. Well, what does that look like for you? And what is that, how does that feel? And then we're able to use sort of more of the sort of the subtle, the poetic, the metaphoric language of Chinese medicine to maybe refine our treatment so that it's not just let's quote unquote calm the spirit with points that do that, but maybe we need to energize certain aspects of what's going on for that person.
Yeah, it's a combination of kind of two different ways of thinking, I guess, for me. Like you mentioned, I think a lot in the Western in terms for pain cases, particularly into like, what's going on with the nerves, the muscles, what do we need to hit in the brain to make this work better? And then, using like you said, the metaphorical language of Chinese medicine to figure out what's driving some of these things and using the points that way as well. It's like a nice way to mesh things with the classic and the current.
Yeah, it's a both and situation, not an either or. And that's something that I would love to see in our polarized world, for us to all agree to be medical pragmatists and just do the stuff that works. Because, drugs and surgery are great for some things. And Chinese medicine is a beautiful solution for so many others. So, Mark, if people are interested in getting in touch with you and learning more about your approach or maybe becoming a patient, where would you suggest that they go?
They can call me at 781-944-3000. The website is 5pointsacupuncture.com, and that 5 is spelled out.
We'll have links to the show notes, so no worries there.
There's actually a 5 Points Acupuncture in Atlanta that is the number 5, and I get calls for them a lot. It's kind of funny. As soon as I hear the Georgia accent, I'm like, you're in the wrong place.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to help me have this conversation and hopefully do some service out there to people for whom they really need to know the science before they're willing to go and give acupuncture a shot. Because I think that is an incredible service of being able to help people get over that sort of mental obstacle.
Yeah, this has been great. It was a lot of fun, Brody. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening today. To check out the show notes, get on my email list, or drop me a line, head to brodywelch.com. That's Brody with an IE and Welch with a CH. I'd love to hear from you. If you learned something new or feel inspired to try something different in your life, I'd love for you to pay it forward by sharing this episode with a friend who you think could also benefit and give them a reason to listen. You'll be helping to create a world where we encourage each other to embody self-respect. Till next time, be good to yourself.